So I recently came across a news headline that a lot of major manufacturing hubs are leaving China and going to Vietnam. And a question popped in my mind. Why? Isn't China already good enough? So I dug deeper, and this is something that can change the manufacturing war entirely on a global scale. To understand this, we need to go back to 2007. Now at this point in time, if you wanted to buy an iPhone, there was really only one place on Earth that could build it for you, and it was China. During this period, China already had a lot of facilities to build the iPhone, and some of them were so efficient they could put together hundreds of thousands of phones a day, with a supply chain of screws, glass, chips, and cables, all within a few hours' drive. And for the next 20 years, that arrangement looked permanent. China wasn't just cheap labor, it was cheap labor plus ports, roads, factories, and a million suppliers who'd spent decades learning to do this better than anyone else. But today, some of those same factories sit half empty. And a few hundred miles south, in provinces most Western consumers couldn't point to on a map, a new supply chain is being built, piece by piece, plant by plant. Now we know that there's another country competing for the manufacturing race with China. But why are companies even going to leave China in the first place? I mean, everything is cheap there, so why? Simple reason: tariff. In 2018, the United States imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese goods. For companies that had built entire business models around Chinese manufacturing, the math changed overnight. A phone or a laptop that cost X to make in Shenzhen suddenly cost X plus a tariff to sell in America. To overcome this, executives came up with another plan and called it China Plus One. The idea is simple. Keep some production in China because you still need it, but build a second supply chain somewhere else. So a tariff, a lockdown, or a diplomatic blow-up in one country doesn't shut down your entire business. Samsung got there first, and got there big. By the mid-2020s, Samsung was manufacturing roughly half of all the phones it sold anywhere in the world, inside Vietnam. More phones from more factories than it made in South Korea itself. Apple followed more cautiously. AirPods, then iPads, then parts of the watch line moved through Vietnamese assembly lines run by the same contractors, Foxconn, Luxshare, Gore-Tex, that had built Apple's business in China in the first place. These weren't new companies learning a new skill. They were the same companies, just changing their location physically. Then came 2020. COVID lockdowns shut Chinese factories with days' notice. Companies that had spent 2 years hedging with a Vietnam Plan B suddenly looked prescient. Companies that hadn't started scrambling to catch up. The pandemic didn't create the shift out of China. It just made every board of directors realize how urgent it already was. Now, you might think there are many other countries with cheap labor. So why Vietnam? Vietnam won for reasons that had been building for years, before anyone in Silicon Valley started paying attention. But there are 3 main reasons they succeeded. The biggest reason being geographic location. Vietnam shares a land border with China. You can truck components across it rather than shipping them across an ocean, which matters enormously to a supply chain that's used to moving parts between factories on a daily basis. A company in Shenzhen can shift a supplier relationship into Vietnam without rebuilding logistics from scratch. Okay, geography factored in, but what are the other 2 reasons? Trade policies and workforce. Vietnam signed on to CPTPP, giving it preferential access to 11 Pacific economies. It also signed a separate free trade agreement with the European Union. And critically, it stayed diplomatically flexible enough to keep good relations with both Washington and Beijing at the same time, which is a harder trick than it sounds. Then there's the workforce. Vietnam's median age sits in the early 30s, younger than China's, whose one-child policy decades ago is now showing up as an aging, shrinking labor pool. Vietnamese wages run meaningfully below Chinese wages for comparable factory work. And the government invested early and heavily in STEM education, betting that the country's advantage wouldn't stay cheap labor forever. It would become capable labor that's still affordable. And as a result, foreign direct investment poured in. Component makers followed the assemblers. Where there's a Samsung phone plant, there's now a Samsung display plant, a Samsung components plant, and dozens of smaller suppliers, who used to sell only to factories in Shenzhen or Suzhou. Okay, now we have understood what's going on. But here's the part that gets left out of the Vietnam is the new China headlines. Vietnam isn't replacing China, it's borrowing from it. Walk into most Vietnamese electronics factories and you'll find final assembly, the last stage, where components get put together and boxed. What you mostly won't find is where those components actually came from. A huge share of the raw materials, chips, and subassemblies that go into a made in Vietnam product were made in China first, then shipped south for final assembly. Vietnam has become extraordinarily good at the last step of a process it doesn't yet control the earlier steps of. That's not a small caveat. It's the central limitation of the whole story. China spent 30 years building an integrated industrial base. Raw materials, components, machine tools, and assembly, all in one place, all talking to each other. Vietnam, with a population 1/15 the size and an economy still maturing, hasn't built that depth yet, and may not for a long time. Infrastructure is the second constraint. Vietnam's ports and highways were built for a smaller economy than the one now running through them. Power shortages have forced factories to run generators during peak season. Land available for large-scale industrial parks is limited and increasingly expensive as demand for it spikes. And there's a subtler problem. Vietnam's own success has made it a target. Some Chinese companies, looking to dodge the same tariffs, have simply relocated a final assembly step to Vietnam and relabeled the country of origin, turning Vietnamese manufacturing into a workaround rather than a genuine shift. Washington has noticed and started scrutinizing Vietnamese exports for exactly that kind of transshipment. So, is Vietnam becoming the next business hub of Asia? In a real sense, yes. Because foreign investment, manufacturing output, and export volumes have all climbed at a pace few economies in the world can match over the same stretch of years. But next, China oversells it. What's actually happening is more specific, and in some ways more interesting. Global manufacturers are building redundancy. Not replacing one supply chain with another, but running two in parallel. A hedge against the next tariff, the next lockdown, the next geopolitical shock nobody saw coming. Vietnam's real achievement isn't that it outcompeted China. It's that it made itself the most credible insurance policy against depending on any single country too much. Whether that's enough to eventually build the kind of deep, self-sufficient industrial base China spent decades assembling, that's the question that will decide whether this decade's headlines were the start of a new industrial superpower or just the most successful hedge in modern manufacturing history.